For some universities, alumni are their former students. But as an alumnus of the University of Pretoria, you're part of our family from the moment you start your journey with us. The pathway that you follow on your journey at UP is paved with striving for excellence, perseverance, adaptability, getting it right the first time, and reaching the finish line. UP is home to many of South Africa's shining stars. You're part of this family, a family that knows the value of hard work, integrity, passion, creativity, and innovation. You're always able to come back home and reconnect with your family all around the world. The UP Alumni Connect app gives you unique access to opportunities like mentorships, careers, and invitations to selected events. Reconnect with us, keep in touch, be proud of your home and your family, and continue to make a difference.
In Pretoria here. Okay, so not far from our offices are not
like 50 minutes, right?
Dear esteemed guests, colleagues, alumni, and viewers everywhere, very good evening to you, and welcome to the LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership Conversation. I am Sebenzile Nkambule. I'm a strategic communications practitioner, a broadcast journalist, and an alumni of the University of Pretoria, and I will be moderating this conversation this evening. The conversation's topic is migration crisis in Africa, and we are asking, where are the fault lines? Before we jump into the discussion, please allow me to invite Professor Kube, the Vice Chancellor of the University of Pretoria.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kambule. Good evening, friends, students. I should say good evening, good afternoon, and good morning. Alumni are global. We run hybrid events, so it's not necessarily evening where they are. Colleagues, and especially to our UP alumni joining us here tonight at the Future Africa Auditorium and joining us from around the world. It is always a pleasure for me to spend time with our alumni who make us proud every day with the work that they do in every field imaginable to create a better world. As many of you will remember, LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership series of conversation was born in a period of great distress during the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic and the hard lockdowns that hit almost every country in the world in the first half of 2020. University of Pretoria is resilient, and so out of the ashes of those lockdowns, we, if you like, initiated this series. I watched with a mix of pride and awe as our alumni relations team moved with great agility to take all their events online. At the same time, launched this LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership series, which aims to bring some of the more than 300,000 alumni that UP has produced back onto a UP stage for a night. Over these 2 years, we have had alumni joined by friends of our university who have not yet had the privilege of studying here alumni who are thought leaders in their field, whether in business, industry, academia, government, civil society, or the arts. Join us as we discuss and debate some of the most pressing issues facing South Africa, our continent, Africa, and the world or the globe. And as we continue to adjust to a world forever changed by this pandemic, it is wonderful to be back here and see you all face to face again. And for you who are online, I'm not forgetting you. It is wonderful to know you are listening to your Vice Chancellor and Principal out there. Some of you will know that I regularly remind our staff and students that the multiple roles a university must play includes a key role of being a change leader in society, being a driver and an agent of change. Whether that means changing the world through cutting-edge research or the change effect of more than 20,000 UP students annually getting their hands dirty, so to speak, by getting out of the classroom and going into communities to pass on their knowledge and otherwise create real change. In line with this imperative for universities to lead in creating change, tonight's conversation will see our panelists, esteemed panelists, including two very impressive UP alumni, I must boast, debate the topic, Migration Crisis in Africa, Where are the fault lines? Some might say that we are dramatizing it by calling it a crisis or adopting someone else's framing. But that is part of what we're going to debate tonight, right? This topic is one that has massive implications, not just for African countries and our continent, but for the entire world. As you see, if you watch television channels around the world, often an image of migration is a rickety boat full of Africans trying to cross over into Europe. Did you know that actually, factually, there's more migration within the continent than those people in those rickety boats? As the continent with the youngest population, Africa is likely to be a key player in the global marketplace in the decades to come. And while discussions around migration often take place under heated circumstances, when issues of xenophobia rear their head, whether in Africa or on European shores, I'm told that the goal of this conversation includes trying to focus on the potential benefits of intra-Africa migration that might be reaped by our collective African nations. Human beings around the world have migrated anyway. So many nations in the world are actually nations of migrants. And many people who consider themselves to be originally there are actually ignoring the indigenous original presence of other people. As a change leader in our society, this topic and the outlines of the debate are in line with the African Union's own objectives as driven by the Global Compact on Migration committed to by all UN member states. In its turn, AU member states have identified 7 priorities within the GCM that the continent will seek to implement in the next 3 years. And they are priorities that we hope to see reflected in the quality of the debate here tonight. These priorities include promoting fact-based and data-driven migration discourse, not the ones that's driven by emotions, prejudices, and other, and other instincts that are not based on fact. This is especially important with a topic that often elicits emotional responses. It is a role of academics, scientists, and thought leaders to say, hold on, let us look at what the research, the facts are telling us before we continue our analysis. And of course, facts have to be contextualized and critically analyzed. The protection of human rights and elimination of all forms of discrimination against African migrants and the diaspora, and addressing irregular migration in the continent, especially the prevention of trafficking and smuggling of migrants on the continent. This is a huge problem. The facilitation of regular migration and decent work, the promotion of migrants and diasporans to fully participate and contribute to sustainable development. Addressing climate change and disasters are major drivers of irregular migration on the continent. As always, I look forward to our panelists' contributions and input from our audience here in the Future Africa Auditorium, as well as from the audience watching online. I'm sure it will be a thought-provoking and enlightening conversation that befits a university of this stature, and that will help shed a bit more light on the path we are building towards a sustainable, peaceful, and thriving African continent and a contribution to the world. I thank you for joining us and look forward to engaging with you after the discussion. Back to you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much, Professor. Certainly, the VC has covered and given us a sense of some of the topics and the issues we'll delve into today, the state of migration. What does the data tell us, right? What are some of the tension points that are around migration that drive anti-migrant sentiment? We've seen ugly scenes of xenophobic violence in countries such as South Africa, populist views as well shared by various leaders and individuals in society. What sort of contribution do those views actually make, right, to how we understand these issues? The pull and push factors that prompt migration, the impact also of migration at a very personal and community level, as well as at national levels as well. And then, of course, what the tangible economic, political, and environmental implications are that result from the flow of people across the continent. Of course, this event is brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations Office. And among our panelists this evening, we have two who are, in fact, UP alumni. So let me jump straight in and present to you our esteemed panelists this evening. And I'll start to my immediate left. We have Mr. Ashraf El-Noor, who is the Regional Director for Southern Africa at the International Organization for Migration, the IOM. And next to Mr. El-Noor, we have Mr. Abi Ashenafi, who is the manager of the Migration Unit at the University of Pretoria's Center for Human Rights, and also a UP alumnus who he informed me just a little earlier on this evening that he's almost done with his PhD, so no pressure. To his immediate left, we have Professor Chris Nchimbi, I beg your pardon, who is the SARCHI Chair in Political Economy of Integration in SADC, and is also Senior Lecturer at the University of Pretoria's Department of Political Sciences. Virtually, we're joined by Professor Joe Very, who is Director of the African Center for Migration and Society at Wits University. Prof. Very couldn't be with us in person this evening. We're also joined by Dr. Nomzamo Malindisa, who is a migration researcher, who's also a UP alumna and former lecturer in the University of Pretoria's Department of Political Sciences. A very good evening to you all, and could we kindly welcome all our panelists, please. We also ask our audience, both in the auditorium and those of you who are joining us online, to please use the hashtag LeadUPConversation when posting about the event. Once we've done our 3 rounds of questions, we'll also then open the Q&A session for you all to engage throughout the conversation. So we look forward to your thoughts as well on this topic. I'll start with you, Mr. El-Noor, just in terms of getting us rooted in what the data actually tells us. Give us a sense of what the state of migration in Southern Africa is currently, and if you can offer some relevant data as well in trends in the region, please.
Thank you very much, Sibinzili. Hello, everyone, and it is my pleasure to be here today and join this important conversation. And I would like to start by setting the record straight. And my first point would be that African migration is not in crisis, and that Africa has a positive narrative on migration. Humanity as a whole has been on the move since the earliest of times, and having African migrating is no exception. Africa is actually having migration deep-rooted in the society, and migration is contributing to both the social and the economic development. And from that perspective, one would see that migration in the Southern Africa region, to a large extent, is determined and defined by inter-regional labor mobility. that it's historically has been the case. And migration then and even now, to large extent, is the common denominator that brings several countries in the region into a single labor market. That could be not so formal, but in many ways, that is how the mobility is centered around the economies and the labor requirements of those economies that are not necessarily coming from one country. So that process has been going on for decades. And as such, migration has become a fundamental contributor to the local communities' livelihoods wherever they go, but they also send remittances and money home to support families. And the migration also provides the labor to the economies. So the economy would keep going, booming, and the society as a whole would function. And one could see that over the past decades, the situation has changed, and that migration patterns, to large extent, have been restructured in many ways, and is mainly because of the many geographic realities that have been influenced by the socio-economic changes, political changes, and demographic changes within the Southern Africa political space, as represented by SADC. And we could see that there is a paradigm shift towards greater mobility beyond just labor migration. Traditionally, it was just labor migration. But what we see recently is that there is much greater mobility beyond just migrant workers and others moving to join the workforce here and there. And that, to large extent, is not far from the Southern Africa human development profile, which is characterized by the presence of several countries that are middle income, with two interesting set of categories. One category of countries that are in high human development index. So this is Botswana, South Africa, Mauritius before. But there are those who are in lower human development index, DRC, Mozambique, Malawi, just to give an example. And as a point that I am making here, as a result of that, we see that the socio-economic inequalities have become a major contributor to driving migration within the region, and also an important feeder to the informal economy, because many of the people who come as a result of these inequalities and the socio-economic differences, they don't join the formal labor market, and many of them, they end in the informal economy and in the markets everywhere. You go to many of the cities in the Southern Africa region, and that is basically what you would see. And more recently, the region is also challenged by two things: the rise in irregular migration, including human trafficking, as the Vice Chancellor alluded in his word. But we also see a steady arrival of undocumented migrants. And every country in the region has its share, could be small, could be a bit larger. But one thing that is common, that the migration officials are no longer dealing with conventional documented arrivals, and that mixed migratory flows are becoming more of the norm, which are more far complex and also challenging. And the challenge is twofold. On one hand, the capacities on the ground to manage migration are overstretched, and in essence, they are limited, so very difficult to cope with the scale. And they are not meant to deal with the way that different migration drivers are coming together and offloading the management, migration management system. And on the other hand, we see that the increase in mixed migratory flows has not only created or increased the scale, but also the complexity in terms of human trafficking, human smuggling, detentions, and even worse, the deaths of migrants.
Let me ask that you pause it there, Mr. Alon, and I'll come back to you. I want to bring in Professor Njimbi. Prof, speak to the political economy of migration. And in your view, does it support Mr. Elno's assertion at the beginning of his response that in fact migration in the region, migration on the continent is in fact not in crisis?
Good evening, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. To respond to your question, I think I would tap into the picture that he paints, that migration is a complex reality. It's not as simple as you would put it out there. So it involves the interplay of various factors: economic, social, political, cultural, environmental. And those in turn would be reinforced by international and global factors, which tend to, first of all, incorporate the African continent into the international system. But then there's also a tendency to marginalize the African continent from the international system. And that again prompts cycles of migration. So it's more or less like a vicious cycle. And it basically points to the fact that migration is a complex phenomenon, it's a complex reality. But just two issues that I would like to highlight in response to your question. First of all, it's the issue that relates to interests. There are various interests when it comes to matters of migration, but basically you can distinguish between pro-migration interests and anti-migration interests. When you have people moving from one country to another, normally their first point of contact is the state. So they will encounter border officials, for example. They will encounter immigration officials. Those represent the state. But the state has interests in terms of who it wants to allow into its territory and who it wants not to leave its territory. And yet, beneath the interests of the states are also, especially within the context of a territory of a state, within the state, there are also interests that influence the state. So you may have, for example, private entities that are interested in having people come into the country to bring in skills, to bring in labor, or even cheap labor. So those will lobby the state to increase the number of people that should be coming into the state. The state itself might be actually particularly interested in migration. So you take, for instance, issues of tourism. The state would be interested in promoting people coming into the country, stay for a while, spend their money so that they oil the economy. We speak of, for example, sometimes health migration, wherein the health sector benefits from people who come into a given country to access health services, because where they are coming from, they are either expensive or they are poor. So all those will factor in and influence the state. But on the other hand, then you have the negative or the anti-migration interests that will also lobby. And remember, the state at the end of the day is governed by politicians. So they will weigh their options. They'll say which constituency at least helps them to maintain their power. If it's the anti-migrant constituency, then they will toe that line and you see tendencies towards that. That's the first thing. The second thing, quickly, I think when you look at Southern Africa and even generally Africa, we need to look at the historical patterns and processes when you talk about migration. And what you will see therefore is that historically there have been economic hubs that have tended to draw migrants. So within the Southern African region, for example, you can talk about Botswana, the diamond mining industry there. We can talk about Zambia, the copper mining industry. South Africa, diamond and gold. And believe me, Zimbabwe at some point was a magnet for migration, the agricultural sector. Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of the region. So you have these hubs that attracted migrants, and basically underlying this is the fact that especially during the colonial period and the apartheid era, you have the interest of private capital that is at play, which brings in migrants and determines the flow of migration in the region. So, and then of course you have countries that would, in the words of Samir Amin and Wilson, would be the labor reserve countries that will supply labor to these hotspots or hubs. So you have your Malawi, you have your Mozambique, you have your Lesotho supplying labor to the neighboring countries. So briefly, I think that's the kind of political economy scenario of the Southern African region, but it can be extended to the rest of the continent. And of course, in the interest of time anyway, I won't go into talking about the theories now surrounding that in terms of labor production and relations of capital to labor and non-labor production.
We may indeed have an opportunity to get back to that, Prof, but thank you for those comments. Let me bring in Prof. Very now as well, and to Professor Njimbi's point about health. If you could speak to what the dynamics of health are, and I suppose that's also a point of tension when people feel that there aren't sufficient resources, and so when you have people coming from elsewhere, also then using what are already limited services, that's also what causes a lot of tension. Speak to us about that, the flow also of movement in relation in particular to health.
Sure, thank you very much, and apologies for not being able to join you this evening in person. I just wanted to start off by going back to the sort of original theme around the language of a crisis of migration, a migration crisis across the continent. And I just wanted to emphasize that from my side, from the research I'm involved in and others, and sort of adding to what others have already said, is that I think it's important to emphasize that we don't have a crisis of migration. If the crisis isn't the movement of people, rather we have a crisis in the governance of migration and a crisis in the attitudes and behaviors of people, both in positions of power and on the ground in relation to migration. And as I'll outline, this burgeoning xenophobic, racist, nationalistic rhetoric that we are witnessing globally, not only across the continent, in both political and public spheres, amplifies the divide between citizens who might be presumed deserving of state-funded services such as healthcare, and non-citizens who are often considered not deserving. And I think that speaks to the tension you've just outlined. So what does it mean when we're trying to think about responding to migration and health in contexts where, due to social inequities, host populations may also be struggling to meet their own socioeconomic and health needs? So we need to really recognize these challenges exist and the context in which we're trying to better understand and respond to migration and health continentally. So why migration and health? Well, engaging with migration, which is a key determinant of health, is increasingly recognized as a global public health priority. And this has big implications when we think about the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly thinking about the targets related to improving health, and particularly the target around achieving universal health coverage. And we know, and there's evidence that clearly shows this, that health responses that fail to engage with migration don't only negatively affect the people who are moving, but it will negatively affect the populations through which migrants move, live, and work. So this was particularly amplified and emphasized during the COVID pandemic, where really, until we are ensuring inclusive responses, there is no public health. So there is no public health without migrant health. And this is something we have to recognize. So we need to better understand the relationship between migration and health to do so. Continentally, we have a high communicable disease burden and diverse historical and contemporary population movements. But in spite of this, our responses Our health responses don't tend to engage with migration, and our responses to migration management don't tend to engage with health. So currently, attempts to push the migration and health agenda within the region have largely failed, but we need to develop interventions that are migration aware. And this is a sort of whole system response where population movement will be embedded as a central concern in the way that we design policies, interventions, and so on. So it's really important that we're thinking about how politically can we bring in this very contentious, challenging topic and around the movement of people into thinking about our health systems responses. And so this is difficult. And I just want to end my intervention by just reflecting on the fact that there is the global health security agenda is an approach that's about protecting global health by thinking about how to implement responses to halt the spread of infectious diseases. For example, the responses we saw in the context of COVID and we still see today. Now, we have to see that this is absolutely important, but we have to remember that in a context where the movement of people is often undesired by states, we have been seeing the ways in which a global health security agenda can be misapplied to encourage further restrictions on movement. So using health as an excuse to prevent movement. And we see this adding to further challenges around anti-foreigner sentiment. I'll leave it there, thanks.
Fantastic way to end it off. Thank you very much, Prof. Veri. Let me come to you, Dr. Nomzamo Malindi. So we thank you for joining us this evening as well. I imagine you may want to also offer some reflections on whether or not you indeed think that the state of migration on the continent is or should be characterized as a crisis or not. Please feel free to do so, but also speak specifically as well to the state of labor as well, where there have been growing calls, in fact, for there to be clearer stances taken by the state on, again, labor, and in a country such as South Africa, where there have been these tensions that we've highlighted already. Give us a sense of what the state of data on migration is in the region, and how, from your work, your experience, is informing policy and decision-making on labor issues, resource management, and regulations on migration broadly.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sebenzile, for the opportunity, and thank you to Samantha and the team for also inviting us to be part of this amazing topic today. I think I will definitely echo Prof. Joe's sentiments to say that migration isn't necessarily a crisis, but the crisis would be with migration governance and issues of migration management at this point. And I think one of the most important things that contribute towards migration governance being a huge challenge in the continent is the lack of accurate and reliable migration data. And so this then makes it very difficult for us to accurately understand not only the impact of migration on our communities and our society, but it also makes it difficult to understand issues of trends that are emerging, as well as how this data can then help us create different or better narratives around migration, particularly when it comes to issues of immigration and the impact that immigrants have on our societies. So with this huge challenge in terms of migration data, I must though acknowledge that there have been great efforts that have been made. We've seen with African governments, as well as all these different stakeholders, including your international labor organizations and IOM. We've seen so many efforts to try and increase our understanding as well as our collecting of migration data, so that we're able to understand indicators such as your migration flows, your migration stock, as well as all these emerging trends within the region, as well as the impact of migration within our countries and within the continent at large. So that should definitely be acknowledged. And I think that also speaks to the issue of migration governance, to say the reason why there's been such an increased interest and increase in efforts to try and get more data on migration is because of this realization that this data is very, very important in helping inform policy as well as other policy interventions when it comes to migration and migration related issues. So we do still, though, have a long way to go, I believe, in terms of the collection of migration data. And I think we really need to be able to gather all this migration data in order to address issues, particularly for South Africa, as has been identified by the National Labour Migration Policy, to address issues of immigrants and immigrant sentiments within the country. So we see that with information that is currently available, we have differing findings or differing perspectives on the kind of impact that immigrants have on South Africa specifically. We've seen work that has been done by the World Bank as well as ILO and most recently IOM when they conducted a study in 2021, looking at the socio-economic impacts of immigrant business owners in South Africa specifically. And what was found there is that immigrants actually do have a positive impact towards the South African economy as well as the labor market. And the contributions that are made by immigrants were highlighted, including the creation of employment, as well as the payments of rents to local or South African property owners, and that being some of the positive contributions that are being made by immigrants, which is normally not documented or is not part of the dominant narrative that we are seeing right now in the country. And so what makes it difficult also for this positive contribution of immigrants to be part of the mainstream discussions or debates on migration is that you find challenges of the lack of regular documentation status for some of these immigrants. And so it makes it difficult then to capture these contributions, these positive contributions that are being made in a regular form, so that we're able to recognize and acknowledge these contributions made by immigrants that are operating within the country. And so by being able to collect data, we would then be able to more effectively understand impacts as well as trends, as well as migration flows and stock, which then will help us not only influence policy, but also influence the dominant narratives in terms of migration and migration impact. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Malindisa, for your comments. I'll invite you now, Mr. Abia Shinafin. Thank you for your time with us this evening. A ton has been said already. Jump on what you will. But double click for us on the sort of human rights abuses related again to various types of migration that you can highlight for us. What are we seeing currently in the region? And I know you want to speak to internal displacement in particular as well. So please offer your insights on those points.
Thank you very much, Sebenzile, and thank you for the Alumni Relations Office for this opportunity. First of all, I would like to state that the violations of rights of migrants can happen because of private citizens as well as by the state. So usually when the state violates migrants' rights, it's either by failing to protect their rights or whether it's by failing to fulfill their rights or by not refraining in respect to their rights. So there are various types of migrants. It can be internal migrants, forced migrants, internally forced migrants. They can be also migrants who are forced and who cross borders. So if we speak about internally displaced persons who are forced migrants within their own state, usually in Africa, in some states, their mere existence is denied because states are concerned about their reputation, so they deny the fact that they exist. That's one of the problems, because if a state denies the existence of internally displaced persons, it means that internally displaced persons cannot get adequate services, humanitarian assistance, and various protection measures that are necessary. That's about the IDPs, or internally displaced persons. In relation to refugees, usually they can be denied of entry because they are considered as migrants or economic migrants, and this violates their right to asylum. Once they are in various states in Africa, of course I'm not generalizing, but there are countries which protect the rights of migrants to the extent that they can, but still there are many problems across the region. One of the problems that is predominant in Africa is the practice of encampment. Refugees are usually encamped in camps, and their right to movement and residence, the freedom to choose their residence, is violated. In severe cases, other rights like the right to life can also be violated. In some regions, in some regions, in some countries, they are forcibly conscripted into military service and put in front lines to fight against, opponents, military opponents. They have also been subjected to enslavement, which is really outrageous, and it has not gotten media attention and condemnation as much as it has to get. So these are some of the violations related to civil and political rights, but migrants' right to social, economic, and cultural rights can also be violated. This includes exclusion from social services, exclusion from economic opportunities, and so forth. So we can name various kinds of violations of the rights of migrants, but these are some of them. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Prof. Shim, I'm going to come back to you, and if we could jump into the issue around anti-foreigner sentiment, right, and how it's in fact showing up. If you could also speak to the question of accountability, right? Given that a lot of the tensions are kind of playing themselves out at a community level. Earlier on, in your comments, you spoke about how some individuals then take advantage of these sentiments, of these tensions as well. Speak to, I suppose, the fears that people have, right? Where there's high competition for jobs, high competition for resources, and now suddenly you pick on the so-called other, you attack them, and we have seen some ugly, violent scenes as well, where the other has in fact been fatally harmed. Are we having the right conversation about who should be held accountable for this? But also, do we have a good understanding of whether these feelings, these fears that people have are justified?
Yeah, a lot has been said about the anti-foreigner sentiments, and actually a lot is being debated currently in countries like South Africa, and there's even, it's gone to an extent where there's debate about what exactly these sentiments should be called. Is it xenophobia? Is it Afrophobia? But I think simply stated, first of all, it begins with a fear of the unknown, or hatred of a person that is projected to be, or groups of persons that are projected to be ethnic. And that's what especially causes it to be sentiments that are negative towards fellow Africans, I think. But more appropriately, I think those negative sentiments, the hatred and the hostility, I think they fit into the category of being xenophobia. There are various scholars that try to interpret the reason why that happens. So you have neo-Marxists, for example, who say it's a fight for limited resources, just as you have asked. But at the end of the day, it seems that that interpretation is limited, because if you say it's a fight for limited resources, how would you explain negative attitudes towards foreigners that happen in affluent communities or parts of the country, where you wouldn't really see a very strong, limited resources per se? So that's one. So you'd find there are actually Latin American scholars that go beyond that narrative, and they'll say migration is just a secondary explanation of what is at stake or what is happening. What is really happening is a broader attempt to, which relates to intersectionality or the classification of human beings. So that at the end of the day, you say that because you seem to come from a certain place, you don't belong in the place that you've newly acquired or entered into, and therefore you do not deserve to share in the resources that are found in that. But at the end of the day, you are classifying people in that sense. And to be very blunt, it boils down to racism.
Mr. Elnor, jump in on that point, and also your views on what sort of frameworks or policies on migration being developed the world over. You've had a global experience, previously held a regional role based in East Africa as well. Thinking in just in terms of frameworks and policies again, what are they telling us about possible solutions that speak to issues such as what Prof. Nchimbi has raised currently?
Very important to give a human face to migration and recognize migrants as right holders, and that their rights should be respected regardless of their immigration status or the background that they come from. And it is important that to remind duty bearers of their responsibilities. And many of them, they are subscribing to instruments at global level, human rights-based instruments, Refugee Convention. Even continentally here, we have IDB's convention, Kampala IDB convention, to which many African countries have been already ratified, I think 33 of them. And at the same time, we need to fight the impunity against the intimidation of migrants, the harassment, and the violence. That should have no place in society. And to get that message out, I think we need to work at different levels. One level, engagement with the host society, but also with the migrants themselves, and to get that message across, message of tolerance, the importance of coming together, respecting diversity, and promoting, human values that bind us together. It's also important to work with governments and to remind them of their leadership role. And that happens at different levels, centrally, regionally, but also at the local level, because in many places, refugees, asylum seekers, or migrants, the first place they touch place, not necessarily at the national level. It could be at the subnational level or the local level. So authorities at those levels, need to be sensitized on the issues. Many of them end in the migrants, and migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers now, with the UN new urban agenda, there is a recognition of their rights to the cities. And mayors around the world are meeting to improve the governance of the cities so that it take into account the presence of migrants. And from that perspective, looking at the policy development in response to migrant situation in Africa, we could see that Africa has a strong policy and legal framework. Continentally, the African Union has a migration policy framework that brings all the member states together, guided by certain principles, and they review it from time to time. The same applies to the regional economic communities, and they are everywhere, different parts of Africa. And the focus of the regional economic communities is usually on the economic integration, but also recognizing the positive contributions in terms of development, remittances, sharing knowledge that Africans, migrants would bring. And important also to recognize that Africa has a strong tradition of being hospitable to refugees. So in many African countries, when refugees arrive, are not necessarily received and supported just by the government, but the first one actually to receive, accommodate, and help them out is the host communities. And that is very important. You know, there's a strong sense of solidarity and responsibility towards those who come and providing them with the help that they need. And based on all that, Africa have best practices when it comes to providing local integration opportunities for refugees who some of them it may not be possible for them to go back home. Repatriation as a durable solution is not possible, or resettlement. So local integration would become one option. Another option, self-reliance for the IDPs, so that they do not continue to be, over-dependent on the handouts and the food assistance that would be given to them. And if I move to the global situation, earlier on there was a clear mention to the importance of the two compacts, the one for refugees, the global compact for the refugees, and the global compact for migration. And they are clear commitments in terms of solidarity and burden sharing when it comes to the refugees, but also more specific to advancing the global governance of migration, not just globally, but at the local and at the regional and at the country level. And the countries also, through the 2030 development agenda, they have already committed through target 10.7 to managing well migration. So that commitment is there, and periodically countries review the progress that they made in that respect. And it's important.
Is it impactful, though, Mr. Elner, just to interject? So is there a positive correlation between the experience of refugees, internally displaced peoples on the ground to these commitments and any other very high level documents that say this is what should be happening on the ground?
Okay, as a good example of that is the at the time the Organization for African Unity Convention on Refugees, adopted in 1969, and this was the first regional binding refugee instrument, and it supplements very well the 1951 Refugee Convention. It has been ratified by 45 African countries out of 55, so there's a good momentum, good number of countries that are already committed to do that, and it is pretty much contextualized to the reality of refugee and displacement in Africa, where you see this large number of people moving from one country to the one next door. And the OAU Refugee Convention is well geared towards that, first. And second, the burden sharing. The principle of no refoulement is very much strong when it comes to refugees arriving from one African country to another. Usually they are not turned back, and they are accepted on their arrival. Mm-hmm. And also the host community provides support, and that doesn't stop there, it starts there, but in many cases it stops with the state itself, given the option of local integration. So it works. And the same I could say to some extent with the Kampala IDB Convention, adopted in 2009, ratified in 2012. 33 countries so far have adopted it, and there are good practices when it comes to self-reliance and moving IDBs away from over-dependency on handouts and helping them to become more productive.
Prof. Very, let me come back to you and to ask whether you concur with Mr. Alnoir's view that it works, but also provide a gender lens on migration, please.
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think that you know, when we're thinking about migration, when we're thinking about what's working, what's not, we need to obviously consider gender within our responses. But it's also key that we don't turn thinking around gender into simply meaning thinking about the needs of women and girls. We need to recognize that gender is about the experiences that different groups may have. And we know that as a result, this might increase vulnerabilities to poor health, or it might negatively impact resilience, for example. But we do need to be very careful about the ways in which we're defining, you know, sort of vulnerability, resilience, and it comes back to also thinking about the ways that we're defining the language even of migrants, and who we mean when we're talking about migrants, and how different language that we use can obviously lead to different responses and so forth. So we need to, I think, acknowledge that if we frame gender, which is sometimes unfortunately happens as something around vulnerabilities, we need to avoid the assumption, or we need to ensure that people don't interpret this, that migrants are alone are responsible for their so-called vulnerabilities, right? So it's important to understand that, you know, it's around the context in which people are moving, are living, are working, that is affecting their abilities to mitigate poor health possibilities, and that these structural issues are as important when we're thinking about access to safe and secure housing as they are when we're thinking about access to safe and secure healthcare. Obviously for women, it is right that we need to think more specifically around particular health needs, particularly around maternal and child health. But we also need to make sure that we sort of move away from the current focus on a pretty heteronormative sort of approach, a binary approach to understanding gender. Because as a result, it means that we are ignoring, or we're sidelining the potential vulnerabilities experienced by, for example, transgender migrants, transgender refugees and asylum seekers, which are a population that are forced to move from many countries across the continent to seek safety and asylum. And South Africa, for example, provides that space of safety, but that's on paper. But what actually happens on the ground, and the ways in which structural factors continue to drive different forms of structural violence, is something we really need to think about. I also wanted to just sort of, you know, quickly sort of, you know, also say that one of the gaps that we see in much of the policies and the programs around managing and governing migration focuses on the people who are moving. And we tend to not think about the families and communities from where those individuals have come. Sometimes there are very positive benefits. Sometimes those benefits might be lessened, or it might be that experiences back home, for example, a family where one parent is away, or thinking about non-traditional family structures where a mother leaves her child with a family member, and she is the one working elsewhere, for example. She will experience, but her child and her extended family will experience certain benefits and challenges associated with that movement. So we also need to make sure that we're recognizing the role of individuals who are in so-called sending households and communities, and the role that they play in supporting much towards the broader development objectives that can be achieved through migration. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Prof. Ferry, for those comments. I'd just like to remind our audience in a moment, I will open it up for some questions. There'll be a roving mic here, and then of course for folks joining us virtually, you can begin to type your questions. We'll be going to those in just a moment, so please do ready yourself. Dr. Malindisa, perhaps if you can pick up on the impact that migration has on the communities that migrants leave, families and so on. Just perhaps to expound on that point, or Prof. Berry's last point in particular, please.
Thank you so much. So I definitely would have to concur with Prof. Berry on looking at the impact of migration, particularly on those that are left behind. So often we find that when we're looking at migration-related matters, particularly when we're investigating migration impact, we're always looking at the receiving states rather than looking at the communities that are left behind in the sending states, and particularly the households, as well as the individuals that are found within those households. And so with the study that I conducted for my thesis, I looked at specifically socioeconomic impact as well as cultural impact of migration for those that are left behind in the Kingdom of Eswatini. And the focus mainly was on the mine workers, migrant mine workers communities. And some of the findings that came out of that empirical study showed that the idea of migration and development, or the migration development nexus, normally says that migration will result in positive impacts on the migrant and their dependents. And what was found in this instance was that economically, as much as these migrant sending households were receiving remittances that were being sent by the migrant worker, they were not necessarily enough to improve the living conditions drastically. So you would find that the remittances that are being received are the only source of income for that particular family. And then that definitely says the money that is being received does not cater for all the needs that particular family would have. And issues of investments as well as savings, as the migration development nexus would actually argue for, would then not be possible because the remittances received were just not enough to cover the daily expenses of that particular family. And with regards to socio-cultural impacts of a migration of a particular family member, what we found was that those that were left behind were affected in a number of ways. So there were impacts also on, particularly with the left behind spouses, there were psychological impacts on them. There was also physical strain as well as emotional strain of having these added responsibilities that came from, the migration of their spouses. And with children as well that are left behind, there were impacts as well with regards to their education, as well as their socialization. Particularly looking at a country like Eswatini, there's also a lot of traditional and cultural practices that are involved in the socialization of young women and men. And so that was found to also be impacted by the absence of the head of household who had migrated in this case. And so that essentially showed that there's a need, when we're trying to understand migration impact, there's a need for us to investigate migration impact on a case-by-case basis in order to understand specifically for each and every different context what migration's true impact is. And that will then help us develop interventions that are centered around not only the economic benefit at the national level of migration, but also to understand how individuals, how families, how communities interact with migration and its impact on their daily lives. And so that becomes extremely important. I think another very important issue to raise up is the need for governments also to understand that migration does not necessarily equate to development. Migration does have developmental benefits, but only if there are social, cultural, as well as economic and political conditions that are conducive for those benefits to actually then result in meaningful changes in the living conditions of those that are involved in the migration process. So yeah, I'll leave it just there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Malindi. May I get an indication already of questions brewing there? Could we get a mic? There are already some folks there. We will begin taking questions in just a moment. Mr. Ashinaf, I'm coming back to you. How might policies, frameworks, regulation be used or better used to entrench a culture, right, of the protection of human rights and foster a social justice approach to how countries respond to the effects, the impact of migration?
Thank you very much for this question. Regulations can foster the protection of the rights of migrants by stipulating the rights of migrants in a manner that has been recognized under international human rights instruments, as well as by imposing obligations on states and various industries and private citizens. In addition to this, there should be a redress mechanism in case of violations of the rights of migrants, so that migrants can claim and defend their rights. So regulation can, better protect the rights of migrants by entrenching their rights, the obligations of states, and redress mechanisms. In addition, it's also important that the rights, especially the social and economic rights of migrants, are protected by clearly, stipulating these rights, so that private individuals as well as states do not violate the fair wage and minimum working conditions that migrants and everyone should have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ashinafi. Let me remind our audience that if you are posting on the socials about the event, do use that hashtag LeadUP conversation and tag all of our pages as well if you're having the conversation there. All right, I'm opening it up to the room now. May I have an indication who's sitting with the microphone? With a set. Kindly just introduce yourself briefly and pose your question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Mboweni Ncube, and I'm an alumni and also still a student here at the University of Pretoria. So my question seeks to take us back to the title of today's discussion, Migration Crisis in Africa. And I've heard that a bunch of the panelists have said that there is no crisis in migration, but there's a crisis in the governance and et cetera, et cetera. But it can come across as an exercise in just semantics. So my question would be, what is the value and the benefit beyond semantics at an interventional level of taking certain constituents of migration and stating that there's a crisis there, but that there's no crisis in migration as a whole?
Thank you. Please pass it to the next person.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. My name is Christopher Isike, and Professor of Political Science at the University of Pretoria here. Regretfully, I'm not an alumni. But I just have two questions quickly. I will ask Mr. Enoa and Professor Very, Dr. Malindisa, and then also Mr. Enoa. So my questions are the kind of social cohesion that Mr. Enoa talks about works better when it is based on facts. So my question is, does the IOM have data on the economic value of migrants to host countries in SADC, for example? So if that is the case, how much has the IOM done to make this known to the general public in preferred migration destinations like South Africa? Right? That would be my question. The second question would be, my disagreement essentially with the notion, like he said, that there's no migration crisis in Africa. And that's why I bring Mr. Enoy back to this question. So let me put it this way. If you are a vice chancellor of a university, right, and you are equipped to admit 2,000 students every year, and then suddenly you have 20,000 students, wouldn't you say that there is an admissions crisis? So wouldn't you say a very high sustained number of people moving from poor and mismanaged countries, both legally and illegally, amounts to a crisis, considering the pressures that this puts on the receiving country, that is probably better managed? So these are questions that goes to Mr. Enoy, Professor Very, and Dr. Malindisa, because for me, essentially, and this is my last point, sorry. May
I please stop you? We have a number of questions, so
we've
captured two of those. Thank you for your questions. Please pass it to the person next to you. But before you ask, Norbert, were you directing it to any of the panelists? Or anybody can take it? Okay, cool. Sir?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mine is just a comment, and again, it's premised on the denial that migration is not a crisis. And I'll be very simplistic by saying that, by pointing out, points that challenges, the notions. To begin with, some of the migrations that we talk about in the past, in prehistory, were really invented by scholars. They didn't happen. When we talk of Bantu migrations, we think it's a fact. It didn't happen. But then there are some non-migrations in history, that generated a serious regional crisis. For example, in Southern Africa, when we talk of the Mfecane, we're talking about rapid and massive human population displacements across the region. This is a fact. And when we look at contemporary Africa, we do also have forced migrations. And these are, in my view, a huge crisis, which is intertwined by things like terrorism, climate change, and even declining resource base, in Africa, like the desertification of the Sahel. So when we are looking at the topic such as migration, I think we don't need, we should desist from looking at the topic as of now. We need to look at it from a medium to long durée, and as well as where we are going with this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Panelists, please, I beg of you to keep it short and sharp for us. We have several coming in online as well, and I'll get to those in just a bit. Prof. Very, let me pick on you and ask you to respond to the questions thrown in your direction.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the questions. I think if I work backwards, and I'll try and keep this very brief, but I think the issue around talking about this broad issue of, do we have a crisis of migration or do we have a crisis of governance of migration? I will still stick by the latter, because we have to also understand that when we're not planning for, when we're not managing, when we're not able to respond to certain forms of movement, even those that are unexpected, for example, in relation to climate change or an environmental disaster, we should still have plans in place for how to engage and respond to those. So I think that's one part of it. I also think that we need to make sure that we understand that governing the various issues that are associated with an overall governance of migration is something that benefits absolutely everyone. It's not something that's exclusive to somebody we call a migrant, a foreign national, for example. It's something that's about strengthening and improving responses for everyone, for ensuring that good governance practices across the continent, where laws are in place to protect individuals, where rights to access certain issues, certain services exist, these apply to citizens as well. So efforts we put in to improving the ways in which those laws, different frameworks are implemented is going to benefit everyone, and it's going to mean that we're managing migration in a different way. But linked to that is about accountability. I mean, this is where it all comes down to. And it comes down to recognizing that nations have signed on to various treaties and so on about protecting individuals who move. But importantly, if we're not holding states to account by saying, right, where are your ombudsmen? Where are the people who are doing spot checks, who are doing, we're looking at performance indicators, we're holding civil servants accountable, we're holding frontline service providers accountable to implement the regulations that exist. We're going to continue to struggle. So I think it's about, in a way, moving to, say, an improved governance regime or an improved governance structure for every state across the continent will benefit everybody. And within that, you can ensure that migration is considered.
Dr. Malindisa?
Thank you so much. I would definitely agree. I think when the idea of migration not being a crisis comes up, it's not necessarily to say that it is a denial that there are challenges, that there are issues that need to be addressed, but rather to say it is the governance, the way that we manage the migration and the movement of people that becomes the problem. Because once we are able to have the right governance structures, once we're able to effectively manage migration, some of these challenges would then be addressed and some of them would be reduced in that manner. So it's not to say that we are specifically from my side, it's not to say that I'm not acknowledging the fact that there are challenges when it comes to migration and that there are challenges when it comes to people moving irregularly and otherwise. But to say if we have the right structures in place in order to manage this inevitable movement of people across borders, then that should be the focus rather than trying to say that migration in and of itself, the movement of people in and of itself is in crisis. So the framing is very, very important in that regard. So yeah, that's what I'd say.
Thank you, Dr. Malindisa. Prof. Jimmy, I'm going to come to you purely because I want to couple the first question, with this online one, where someone online asks, if there was zero conflicts on the continent and climate change was under control, what would be the main driver for migration? So if you could couple that along with the question around the value at an interventional level, right? So the value of semantics was how it was framed, if I paraphrase a bit.
Yeah, if there was zero conflict on the continent, people would still migrate. And that's the simple answer. And so even if you put in place measures to stop people from migrating, to curb them, whatever wall you can build to stop people, they will still migrate and they'll still find a way. So migration is a way of life. And picking on from what Dr. Malindisa and Prof. Viri have said, I think we need to latch on the two notions that the discussion was revolving around, the notion of migration management and migration governance. Those are notions which now bring into sharp focus generally the tendency by states to seek to shake off responsibility on planning for migration and managing migration properly. So when you talk of migration management, generally what it means is that you would put the responsibility of taking care of migrants within your territory on the state. And the states are not willing to do that, or they wouldn't want to really commit themselves to do that, because you're speaking of the rights of the migrants and things like that. But let me end my response with a very simple contemporary scenario. You have the UK and you have Uganda, two totally different countries in terms of economic wealth. The UK is developed, or whatever they call it. Uganda is a poor country, but Uganda hosts about 1 million refugees. And actually it goes to an extent of giving them land to work the land. The UK is now seeking to deport or to contract the processing of refugees to a poor country. So what does that say about migration management and governance?
Mr. Alna, let me come to you as well. Two questions thrown at you. Please go for it.
First, I should appreciate the reflection and even more the concern that's shared about whether what we face, is it really a migration governance crisis, or that migration in itself is a crisis. And I think what would be helpful is to do a reality check. And if we look at the Africa migration, most of it, as some said earlier, is internal. So out of the 39 million African-born migrants, the Africa to Africa corridor is populated by 21 million. That leaves some 18 million who would out-migrate outside Africa. And in terms of percentage, 53% of the African migrants would rather move within the continent. And to manage that volume, Africa has instruments. At the regional level, many of the RECs, whether it's ICAD or ECOWAS and East African Community, and even here in SADC, to some extent, there is a regime that helps to regulate those movements. Some are more generous than the others, but the whole idea is to not let migration management get out of hand, or rather manage it in a way that it will become more orderly, safely, etc. And Africa is even moving beyond that. The African Union recently adopted the protocol to the treaty establishing the African Economic Community on the free movements of persons, the right of residence, the right of establishment. The fact is that it is so far ratified only by 4 countries. But the vision is there, at least, and some more work that needs to be done. And in every sub-region, there are regional consultative processes that will bring countries in the region together. Like in this SADC region, we have the migration dialogue for Southern Africa, MITSA. It has been going on for more than 20 years. It's a neutral, impartial, and informal platform that would allow the countries to share concerns, information, and hopefully move towards some joint action. When it comes to the generosity of the continent to refugees, which is unique compared to other regions of the world, 1/4, which is 25% of the total refugee figure, is hosted by Africa. If we look at the global IDPs, 53 million, Africa's share is also close to 1/3 of that. And again, despite the huge burden, the continent remains hospitable to refugees. There are many best practices of accommodating, supporting refugees, etc. I think there are many good enablers that are already in place that we need to use them to help us manage migration well. The 2 compacts for refugees and IDPs is one. Target 10.7 of the SDGs where there is the commitment to manage well migration, but also regional. We should not forget that migration is not going to disappear. It will remain with us, and it will stay to be a necessity for those fleeing violence and even natural disasters. It's desired economically, but it has to be well governed, and I think that is the real issue.
Just quickly, there was also a question about the IOM's the data on the economic value of migration in SADC.
The short answer to that, we don't have that data, and that data is really hard to get. But I will give you some global model. I think that model was done some time back by McKinsey. There was a study that looks at the global economies that has a high share of migrants in those countries. And they look at the number of the GDP that is created by that country. Let us hypothetically, let us say that it is $400 billion, hypothetically. And they looked at the share. If that economy is just functioned without migrants, would it be still 400 billion or less? And in many examples, they found that the contribution of migrants to the GDP is significant. And I think this is what we need to do in this region, but data is hard. We need to work and get it better on that.
I'll take your question quickly in a second. But there was one about, team, just go back up for me. There was one about yes, this one. How can African migrants be protected from false job adverts, but also how can communities, what can communities do to verify advertisements in other countries? Mr. Shanafi, perhaps you take that one. While you think of it, quickly from you, please, if you can make it 30 seconds, your question.
Is this one?
Yes,
yeah.
there we go.
Good evening. My name is Diego Iturralde. I'm Chief Director for Demography and Population Statistics at Statistics South Africa and an alumni of the University of Pretoria as well. There's a lot around the field of migration statistics, which I could speak about, and just to share with you some initiatives that Statistics South Africa is involved in with regards to the development of migration statistics. And all of these initiatives really touch on part of the conversation that we've been having this evening. I would not agree entirely with the comment made that there's a lack of migration statistics. There certainly is a lot more that can be produced and that can be put out there to inform conversations like this. But I would maybe like to share some of the challenges that I think we have in South Africa, in Southern Africa generally, and maybe pose that as a question. And that would be, how do we make sure that policy developers, people implementing programs, make use of evidence, and how do we hold such people accountable with further evidence to ensure that these policies and programs are working. I think afterwards we can have an extended conversation about these various initiatives. But I think maybe one thing which I can mention is that the Cabinet of the South African government has approved the establishment of a Migration and Urbanization Forum, which StatsSA and Department of Social Development are leading. And this is a platform where a wide variety of conversations about migration governance and how it intersects with migration data is able to take place. And we intend, with the help of the IOM, by 2024 to produce a migration profile report as well as a migration statistics hub for the government of South Africa. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just quickly, I would like to welcome the comment on migration data, which I think a point of order to say migration data exists, but there are limitations, and I think that was my point. Because the limitation could be context specific. For example, in this region we have we collect data on displacement matrix, which more focus on forced displacement situation, refugees, IDPs, irregular migrants. But when it comes to the economic data, this is where we need to do some work. Also, data needs to be maybe updated more often, and maybe to be less partial than it is now. So the joint work that we need to do together, and I welcome the partnership that we are already having in place, and there's a lot more that we could do with you and others as well.
Thank you. Mr. Shanafi, on the human rights and the jobs in particular, the question online before we close.
All right. Thank you. One of the things that can be done is to sensitize people that are prone to be trafficked. So this can be done by the government or civil society organizations, so that they will not be lured into false job adverts. The other thing is governments can also do controls when they exit. These are some of the things that can be done. The other question is if there is no conflict or climate change disasters, people do still migrate. Yes, they can. This is because it's not only conflicts that drive migration. For example, development-induced migration, forced migration occurs in Africa and across the world. For example, more than 15 million people are driven out of their homes because of development. And other reasons can also drive people out of their homes. So this is all I can say.
Brilliant. What we do have a crisis of right now is being out of time. I'm afraid I cannot take any more questions. Thank you for your engagement online and also in the room. And thank you once again to my wonderful panelists, Dr. Nomzamo Malindisa, Professor Joe Very. Thank you, Professor Njimbi, Mr. Ashinafi, as well as to you, Mr. Elnoor. Kindly, just applause, please, for our guests. Please do join our next LeadUP Alumni Thought Leadership discussion scheduled for the 17th of August. Today's event was brought to you by the University of Pretoria's Alumni Relations team. Good evening. Ladies and gentlemen, may I kindly invite you all please to join us for a cocktail reception.